to facilitate the illicit trade in people, animals, drugs, and weapons. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to give an opening statement. My district is the hometown of former President Harry Truman. He lived in Independence, which is sort of a suburb of Kansas City. It is also the site of the Harry Truman Presidential Library and many, many hardworking Middle Americans. In November of last year, a federal raid involving Independence, Missouri police officers resulted in the arrest of 21 individuals in a human trafficking sting operation. The arrest reminds me that the scourge of trafficking is all around us. My home state of Missouri ranked 16th in the country for human trafficking cases, with 114 cases reported just last year. Our country is among the top 3 origin points for this wicked scheme and system. Today, 24.9 million people worldwide are victims of human trafficking. This reality grips our heart and grabs our attention. However, it is a slice of a much broader and invidious structure. Trafficking in all forms, drugs, animal, weapons, humans, whatever, is a mechanism to make, move, and clean dirty money. It allows for criminal systems to flourish, from ISIS fighters who have looted World Heritage sites and sell ancient artifacts to bankroll their war machine, to those who sell counterfeit medication to desperate and ailing people. Trafficking is an enormous financial enterprise, amounting to somewhere between $1.6 trillion and $2.2 trillion. The Department of Treasury's 2020 National Strategic and Combating Terrorist and Illicit Financing highlights that the same strengths, and I quote, that make the United States an attractive destination for legitimate investment, a large economy and open business climate, investment in financial services, also can attract criminals and other illicit actors seeking to hide or disguise their ill-gotten gains or fund their dangerous plots, unquote. The illicit system knows no race, creed, nor party affiliation. It unifies us as a potential victim and today unites us in opposition to this common threat. It is for this reason that I'm excited under the leadership of Chairwoman Waters to join with Ranking Member Hill in launching this initiative to directly confront trafficking in all forms. This hearing will be the first in a series aimed at examining curtailing trafficking at its roots. As many of my colleagues will agree, we have done a lot of legislative nipping at the fringes on this problem. It is now for us to strike at its core. This hearing will lay the framework for this conversation and hopefully will provide our committee insight and future direction. As we start this dialogue, it is important to engage from a frame of common understanding. We know that there is cross-cutting and collaboration across trafficking networks within our system. There is a convergence in human trafficking and drug trafficking roots, as well as the WMD trafficking and narcotics trafficking networks. There are also common mechanisms and vulnerabilities that trafficking facilitators are exploiting within our financial system to enable their illicit activities. We also know that the very crime of trafficking is evolving. This January, a joint investigation involving the United States, Germany, the Netherlands, Northern Ireland, and the United Kingdom helped take down a website which the Justice Department says sold billions of stolen usernames, passwords, and other data. One credit union in my district notes that 20% of their cards were affected by data breaches in 2019. And CNBC reported that hackers may have accessed over $8 billion in consumer records in 2019. So I'm eager to start this conversation and hear from you all about these issues as well as the legislative issues before us today, championed by my colleague, Mr. Foster, and Congressman McAdams. I look forward to hearing from all of you. I recognize now the Ranking Member Hill for 4 minutes for an opening statement.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for convening this hearing. Thank our witnesses for participating today. This is indeed a topic that we care about deeply on both sides of this dais. I appreciate Chair Waters caring about it and helping lead this human trafficking initiative within our committee. Similar to our last subcommittee hearing, in the 5 years that I've been working on illicit finance issues, I don't remember analyzing it from the point of view of trafficking. So I look forward to an interesting dialogue and learning ways to mitigate these threats. In my home state of Arkansas, drug trafficking continues to be a heightened concern. I've heard stories from many heartbroken Arkansans detailing the opioid crisis that has claimed the lives of their young ones. We can't allow more families to be destroyed by the opioid crisis, which is killing more than 130 Americans a day. Overdoses are rising across Arkansas, and fentanyl continues to be a growing threat in our communities. That's why I'm proud to lead H.R. 2483, the Fentanyl Sanctions Act, with my friend Congressman Rose of New York, which is the first ever fentanyl sanctions effort in the House. The legislation would apply pressure on the Chinese government to honor their commitment to make fentanyl illegal and provide the United States with more tools and resources to go after illicit traffickers in China, Mexico, and other countries. A couple years ago, I had the pleasure of meeting Vanessa Newman, a Venezuelan-American diplomat who now consults on ways to dismantle illicit finance. Her 2017 book, Blood Profits: How American Consumers Unwittingly Finance Terrorists, details a variety of ways of the $400 billion counterfeiting industry and how it's funding terrorism around the world. She outlines that 11% of the approximately 5.7 trillion cigarettes smoked every year are illicitly traded. The illicit tobacco trade is larger than the illicit trade of oil, wildlife, timber, arts and cultural property, and blood diamonds combined. Furthermore, the funding of tobacco trafficking often comes from developed economies, including the United States. To that end, I'm disappointed that we were not able to have a tobacco trafficking witness here today for the panel. I understand that this industry can often be politically charged in nature and can take away from the larger discussion. However, it would have been valuable to learn just how persistent and tobacco trafficking is financed and how it is benefiting terror organizations. Today, I'm also interested in learning more about the financing of trafficking and how and when the lines between terror financing and trafficking financing become blurred. As I understand it, following the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, President Bush invoked an executive order, which has made it more difficult for terrorist groups to access their funding. As a result, global terrorism has merged with organized crime to create financing workarounds. These intertwined transnational relationships are complex and very adaptive. And with that, let me yield the balance of my time to my friend from North Carolina, the ranking member, Mr. McHenry.
Well, I thank the ranking member for yielding, and I thank the panel for being here. This is quite a challenging issue for us to tackle. This committee has the capacity, has the jurisdiction to limit, inhibit, impair, delay the ability for traffickers to fund themselves. So we're looking for ideas to meet this challenge, and there is consensus on both sides of the aisle that we have to do something, we have to take action. So I'm grateful that we have a bipartisan panel and a bipartisan hearing, and I thank Chairman Cleaver for convening this, and I look forward to the testimony.
Thank you. Today we welcome the testimony of 5 witnesses. Our first witness today is Ms. Tagzan Casanova. How badly did I do it? Okay, just say badly.
It's Tagzan Kasenova.
Oh, that's, oh Lord. Thank you for being here. Dr. Casanova is a senior fellow with the Project on International Security, Commerce, and Economic Statecraft at the Center for Policy Research, SUNY Albany, a senior non-resident scholar at the Institute of International Science and Technology Policy at the Illicit School, and a non-resident fellow at the Nuclear Policy Conference at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace from 2011 to 2015. She is served on the United Nations Secretary General's Advisory Board on Disarmament Matters. The next witness, Mr. Atkins, has nearly 20 years of experience working with vulnerable populations in over 50 nations across Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. He has held leadership positions at the National Democratic Institute, Interactions Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, Human Rights, and international organizations, among others. He is currently a lecturer on U.S. policy, African and security studies at Georgetown University. The next witness, Selena B. Relulia. Thank you for being here. She is professor of practice at the William J. Perry Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies at the National Defense University, where she focuses on U.S. national security, illicit networks, transnational organized crime, counterterrorism, and threat finance issues in the Americas. As a former U.S. diplomat, international banker with Goldman Sachs, U.S. counterterrorism official, and professor of international security affairs at the National Defense, Georgetown, George Washington, and Joint Special Operations Universities. Professor Rael has over 2 decades of international experience in the public, private, and academic sectors. Our next witness is Gretchen Peters, an authority on the intersection of crime and terrorism, money laundering, and transnational crime. She is executive director of the Center on Illicit Networks and Transnational Organized Crime. She chairs the Alliance to Counter Crime Online, serves on the advisory board of the Center on Economic and Financial Power, and previously co-chaired OECD Task Force on Wildlife and Environmental Crime. Our final witness is Angel Nugent-Swift, who is an advisor and independent consultant with Enigma Technologies, a data intelligence company, where she most recently worked as the Vice President of Compliance and Financial Crime Solutions. She is also the creator of STAT, Stand Together Against Trafficking Project, which connects the anti-human trafficking community to identify and share financial indicators of human trafficking activity. To further this mission, she has partnered with Polaris, the Association of Certified Anti-Money Laundering Specialists, and Enigma to leverage technology to empower the sharing of these financial indicators across the anti-financial crime community. Thank you all for being here. I apologize for slaughtering the pronunciation of your names. Witnesses are reminded that your oral testimony will be limited to 5 minutes. Without objection, your written statement will be made a part of the record. We will begin with you, Ms. Raul. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Cleaver, Ranking Member Hill, members of the House Financial Services Subcommittee on National Security, International Development, and Monetary Policy, for this opportunity to appear before you today to testify on the threat posed by global illicit networks to U.S. national security. Illicit networks include terrorists, criminals, rogue states, and their facilitators. They engage in a diverse set of activities, including human, drug, arms trafficking, kidnapping, extortion, and money laundering. These nefarious networks share land, air, maritime, and cyber domains, tactics, and financial facilitators around the world. While the crimes they commit are not new, globalization has supercharged criminality in terms of scale, geography, income, and sadly, the violence that accompany it. From unprecedented drug overdose deaths here in the United States to record cocaine production in Colombia and the dramatic humanitarian crisis in Venezuela, global illicit networks are threatening the prosperity and security of the Western Hemisphere. In Venezuela, external actors like Cuba, Russia, China, Iran, Hezbollah, Turkey, and Colombian armed groups, along with the illegal gold, oil, and narcotics trade, are sustaining Nicolas Maduro's authoritarian regime, whose tyranny and economic malpractice have led to over 5 million Venezuelans fleeing their country. Meanwhile, Mexican cartels capitalize on Mexico's proximity to the U.S. as a destination country for migrants and for illegal drugs. The cartels operate like corporations, assessing market supply and demand, securing supply chains, and financing their operations. They engage in all types of trafficking, including drugs, migrants, guns, gasolines, and even avocados. Just as they diversify their criminal activities, they launder their proceeds through banks, money services businesses, bulk cash smuggling, trade-based money laundering, front companies, and in cyberspace. Sadly, a culture of corruption, impunity, and weak government institutions enable these Mexican cartels. They're extremely well-armed and use violence to empower themselves, resulting in a record 35,588 homicides in Mexico in 2019. They continue to control lucrative smuggling corridors across our southwest border and partner with Colombian traffickers, Central American gangs, and international facilitators. Despite the extradition of the notorious leader of the Sinaloa cartel, El Chapo Guzman, Sinaloa remains powerful and has gone global, distributing drugs to over 50 countries as far as Australia, and engaging with Russian arms dealers and Chinese money launderers to support its operations. The Mexican cartels are actually fueling our opioid epidemic in our country. Illicit fentanyl, 50 times more potent than heroin, is smuggled into the U.S. directly through the Postal Service from China, but increasingly across our southern border. Orders and purchases from China are brokered online and financed through a variety of mechanisms to include online payment processors and virtual currencies. The marketplace for narcotics like heroin, fentanyl, and increasingly methamphetamines has expanded with the use of technology and the darknet that provides efficiency, ease of payment, anonymity, and convenient delivery by mail. This online evolution is truly disrupting the traditional marketing and distribution aspects of narcotics trafficking. So you might ask, what are we doing to counter the Mexican cartels and address the opioid epidemic? The U.S. and Mexico continue to strengthen their close cooperation to reduce demand, interdict drug flows, cut off the funding, and dismantle these cartels. Since the start of the Merida Initiative in 2008, the U.S. has helped Mexico more effectively eradicate poppy, detect labs, follow the money, prosecute drug traffickers, and enhance border security. Cartel violence in Mexico made world headlines last October when Mexican security forces, overpowered by the Sinaloa cartel in a violent gun battle, were forced to release one of El Chapo Guzman's sons wanted for drug trafficking in the U.S. Then in early November, criminal gangs ambushed and killed 9 U.S. Mexican women and children from the LeBaron family in Sonora, Mexico, sparking outrage on both sides of the border. To counter the cartels and the opioid epidemic and the evolving drug trade, our two countries must continue to reduce demand and supply, counter money laundering, and enhance our cyber measures to monitor and, more importantly, fight the scourge of how these illicit networks are financing themselves. Both countries need to keep up with the rapid changes in the production, marketing, financing, and delivery of narcotics, particularly synthetics, that are threatening the security and prosperity of our region. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Atkins, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Cleaver, Ranking Member Hill, and members of the subcommittee, thank you so much for the honor of inviting me to testify today. I'd like to begin with a note of sincere thanks for your leadership and elevation of the critical issues related to illicit trafficking and the ways in which it devastates individual lives, families, and communities, as well as the environment and national and global security. I want to congratulate you all and thank you for launching the Bipartisan Counter-Trafficking Initiative. This is exactly the kind of high-level and comprehensive effort needed to advance our legislative and law enforcement capacities, as well as our efforts at transnational cooperation, providing us with the data, oversight, and information sharing capacity to close the gaps in operational agility that we have in comparison to bad actors and illicit traffickers. Over the course of today's hearings, we will hear much in the way of data and statistics, outlining the scope and scale of illicit flows. My hope is that the quantitative data will always be wed to the qualitative nightmare of the human beings caught in the web of trafficking in persons. This global phenomenon has destructive and far-reaching social, economic, and political implications for individuals and governments at the local, national, regional, and international levels. Though there is some variance by sub-region and form of exploitation, women and girls are the primary targets of human trafficking worldwide. While the exploitation of trafficked human beings takes place in a variety of forms, the two most prevalent are sexual exploitation and forced labor. In terms of recent trends in the flows and movement of trafficked people, while human trafficking is a global and transnational challenge, the overwhelming majority of those detected are still within their countries of origin, not in foreign destination countries. Trend lines also make clear that the international movements of trafficked persons is overwhelmingly from more impoverished regions into wealthier and more affluent countries in the world. Since the almost universal ratification of the United Nations Trafficking in Persons Protocol in 2003, there's been a surge in nations creating legislative schemes to criminalize human trafficking worldwide. This surge coincides with the increased reports of the detection of trafficking victims over the past several years. While this could indicate an increase in the number of trafficked persons, it is likely to also indicate the national capacity improvement of nations for data collection, trafficking, and detection of human trafficked individuals, and that they have improved. While the sub-regions of sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa and the Middle East have seen improvements as well, they lag behind in detection and convictions, making them regions of relative impunity for human traffickers. While human trafficking and its convergence with other forms of illicit trade are justifiably viewed as security threats in their utility to finance transnational criminal organizations and terrorist groups, these threats are also rooted in the deep development challenges posed by weak and ineffectual states, including poor governance, official corruption, extreme poverty, regional instability, unresolved conflict, and excessive disease burdens. Issues which place African populations at greater risk for the abuse, exploitation, and trauma of human trafficking. The illicit market for trafficking in persons has been linked to multiple crimes, which enrich transnational criminal organizations and terrorist groups, including kidnapping, fraud, rape, commercial sex work, and the breaking of immigration and border laws, as well as money laundering and tax evasion. Trafficking in persons both converges with and helps to sustain transnational criminal organizations as well as terrorist organizations. I'll close by saying that to get to the heart of this challenge, we certainly must address the methods, tactics, and the financing mechanisms of criminal organizations, but also the enabling environments that support their existence and growth. Thank you.
Mr. Atkins, Dr. Casanova, you have 5 minutes.
Dear Chairman Cleaver, Ranking Member Hill, esteemed members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to contribute to this hearing. If a 10-kiloton nuclear bomb, like the one that North Korea tested, is dropped on Washington, D.C., a fireball of almost 500 feet in radius will cover the city. Within a half-a-mile radius, up to 90% of people could die without medical help, some of them within hours. Stealing or buying ready-made weapon is a next to impossible feat. The main path to a bomb is to procure dual-use components on the international market and then build a weapon. Proliferators buy good quality goods from American, European, and Asian suppliers. This means they pay for these goods through the formal financial system, making financial institutions part of their proliferation schemes. Financial institutions struggle with identifying transactions related to procurement, fundraising, and movement of money for illicit WMD programs. They do not have technical expertise on which goods are sensitive. They lack information on who will use these goods and for what purpose. The sanctions-related list scanning software returns a high number of false positives. Plus, such lists contain names of known proliferators and are not useful for catching new bad actors or identifying those who hide under false identities. Proliferators extensively use shell and front companies. They also abuse correspondent accounts, and that is the main vulnerability to the US financial system. At the same time, financial institutions can be important players in the fight against proliferation. But to do that, they need to improve their capacity for detection. And there are some simple steps that they can take. For example, they can request more detailed information on the type of business from customers as part of service suitability for high-risk products like trade finance or wires. They can better scrutinize phone numbers and addresses. It is common for front and shell companies associated with WMD procurement to share managers' addresses and phone numbers. They can adopt new tech solutions to monitoring trade finance instead of a manual review of trade documentation. This can involve, for example, blockchain-based trade finance platforms. They can also incorporate tailored geographical factors into transaction monitoring. We know, for example, that many front companies working on behalf of North Korea reside in specific municipalities in China. Similar to money launderers, proliferators favor formal financial systems and rely on shell and front companies to avoid detection. But there are also important differences. Transactions related to WMD procurement look like legitimate commercial activity. And in addition to individuals, entities, and transactions, there is an emphasis on goods on which financial institutions do not have expertise. Despite the differences, it is worth approaching various kinds of illicit financing holistically. We know that proliferation agents engage in other types of financial crime. The most notorious case is North Korea. It fundraises, moves the funds, launders money, and pays for its WMD program via global financial system. In some cases, proliferation financing was uncovered because of suspicious indicators related to money laundering. As far as public-private partnerships are concerned, creating opportunities for all relevant actors to share information can help uncover such networks. For example, export control authorities have expertise on dual use and military goods and information on export license approvals and denials, as well as blacklists of violators. Customs and border security agencies have information on the movement of sensitive goods. This information can be extremely helpful to financial institutions. While financial institutions are constrained in terms of disclosing proprietary information, they can share their insights on the patterns that they see of suspicious financial flows. And these can detect proliferators as well as add to our understanding of how these networks operate and how they finance their activities. Existing public-private partnerships such as FinCEN Exchange or Gimlet in the UK and others are a great start. Going forward, it is worth considering how to involve smaller and medium-sized banks into such partnerships. Finally, academic institutions, NGOs, and think tanks, they're becoming increasingly indispensable in confronting proliferation financing by contributing to research and capacity building efforts. And they should be recognized as important actors and utilized fully as a valuable resource. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Peters, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Cleaver, Ranking Member Hill, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for giving me an opportunity to testify today. I also want to thank my daughter Isabella, who came with me. I'm the executive director of the Center on Illicit Networks and Transnational Organized Crime, and I also co-founded the Alliance to Counter Crime Online. I have a long history of tracking organized crime and terrorism. I was a war reporter in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and I authored a book about the Taliban and the drug trade. That got me recruited by the US military to support our intelligence community. I mapped transnational illicit networks for Special Operations Command, the DEA, and CENTCOM, and I still provide training to the intelligence community. In 2014 and 15, I received grants from State Department and US Fish and Wildlife to map wildlife supply chains from Africa to Asia, running investigations in South Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, Gabon, and Cameroon. These projects illuminated two important trends. One, at the transnational level, wildlife supply chains converge directly with other serious organized crime, from drugs to human trafficking. Two, an enormous amount of organized crime activity has moved online. I'm going to discuss that later. Criminal supply chains look the same no matter what commodity they move. I have submitted this graphic of what I like to call the martini glass model. It breaks down the criminal supply chain into three sectors: the production sector, where raw materials are cultivated or produced; the distribution sector, where goods are shipped transnationally, and the retail sector, where goods are sold to consumers. Both ends of the criminal supply chain, the production and retail sectors, are characterized by having many actors who earn lower profit margins. These might be the farmers growing drug crops in Colombia or Afghanistan, or the guys selling dime bags on street corners. They are the highly visible aspects of the criminal activity, and therefore they are the most frequent targets of law enforcement. But they are inconsequential to the operation of the supply chain, and they are easily replaced if arrested. Controlling the supply chains are those in the middle of it, in the stem of the martini glass, the distributors or traffickers. They tend to finance the entire supply chain. They have much higher profit margins, and they are much harder to replace when interdicted. In 2017, I published an article called The Curse of the Shiny Object, which was submitted as part of my testimony today. The shiny object curse happens when the visible or attention-grabbing aspect of a problem or a crime distracts from identifying and countering its core drivers. The shiny object curse impacts crime policy. Think of the billions of dollars the U.S. government spent spraying drug crops in Colombia and Mexico, or stop and frisk policies here at home. Congress has also poured millions of dollars into anti-poaching projects across Africa, aiming to stem a conservation crisis that threatens rhinos and elephants and other iconic species with extinction. But poachers, like drug farmers, are inconsequential to the overall supply chain. It's more efficient, and you're going to have more impact to target the traffickers. If you break the stem of the martini glass, you disrupt the supply chain for longer, and you disconnect the actors at either end. The martini stem is where convergence occurs, since traffickers move multiple types of illicit goods. Their skill set is to move shipments through the global transport system. And money launderers clean those illicit profits, and they don't care either if the money comes from human trafficking, drugs, nuclear material. It's just money. In 2016, when I was supporting DEA's Special Operations Division, I had the opportunity to screen undercover recordings of a major African trafficking network. The kingpin was bragging to the undercovers about moving drugs, ivory, and people. And he would say, we have a route through Mombasa. We also have a route in and out of Dar es Salaam. We have a route into Maputo. He wasn't talking about roads or runways. He was talking about corrupt pathways. Distinguished members, U.S. law enforcement is organized around what's in the box being smuggled. But what we should be focusing on is disrupting the corrupt systems and pathways that allow smuggling to occur. Lastly, I'd like to address the issue of online crime. Just like commercial commerce and communications, a large portion of illicit activity has shifted online. But the laws governing the tech industry are out of date. Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act still grants expansive immunity to tech firms for user-generated content, even when it's criminal activity and even when the tech firms know it is. Take the fentanyl crisis, which is now killing more than 60,000 Americans every year. It's well known that Chinese traffickers are marketing fentanyl-laced opioids through fake pharmacies that are advertised on platforms, search engines, and social media. Google and Facebook both host thousands of these illegal pharmacies, and somehow that's still not against the law. Distinguished committee members, I want to request your support as a committee to support reform to CDA 230 to make tech firms liable for hosting serious crime content, just like the financial services industry is liable for hosting criminal content. I have submitted amendments to both proposed bills, Confront and the Stopping Trafficking bill, to specify the need for government research into how criminal networks are exploiting cyberspace. Thank you for focusing on this important issue.
Thank you. Ms. Swift, you're recognized now for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Cleaver, Ranking Member Hill, and members of the subcommittee, I'm honored to appear before you today to discuss an issue that is so incredibly important to the fabric of who we are as a society and that is ripe for meaningful solutions and progress. I've been very fortunate to be a part of a passionate and dedicated community of professionals who work tirelessly protecting the financial system from illicit and nefarious activity. The community I'm referring to is the anti-money laundering and counter-financing of terrorism community, more modernly known as the anti-financial crime community. This includes financial institutions, law enforcement, government agencies, nonprofit organizations, and even now, technology companies. For the past 18 years, I've seen criminal networks time and time again exploit and abuse our financial systems, First, as I joined the Manhattan District Attorney's Office as a prosecutor on September 4th of 2001. Then, as I sat across the World Financial Center, right across from Ground Zero, leading efforts to build the Financial Intelligence Unit at American Express, and most recently, in my position at Enigma Technologies, where I intimately learned how data and technology can play a crucial role in our AML CFT ecosystem. It is through these experiences I am more convinced than ever that the only way to successfully dismantle trafficking organizations which so brazenly exploit multiple aspects of humanity, environment, and safety is through coordinated, collaborative communities that build and share financial intelligence. It is with this conviction that the Stand Together Against Trafficking, or STAT, initiative was created 3 years ago. There are 3 main points I hope to convey in both my oral and written testimony. 1, financial intelligence and evidence is crucial to secure successful prosecution of all trafficking networks, and we need to help law enforcement better understand the financial services system. 2, financial institutions are well positioned to assist law enforcement in identifying strong investigative leads, given that, as you've heard from the entire panel, that even though trafficking networks are different, they exhibit overlapping financial indicators, and in fact, there are many proactive, ongoing efforts led by financial institutions to identify these indicators. 3, in order to truly step up progress, a more unified, multidimensional, collaborative ecosystem to share knowledge must be established, ideally with the support and coordination through government agencies. Financial intelligence allows law enforcement to secure irrefutable evidence that defines business models of criminal enterprises, affirms traffickers' motivations, alleviates burdens for victims and eyewitnesses, assists in identifying third-party facilitators like gatekeepers, attorneys, accountants, real estate professionals, all of which we should be holding more accountable, allows law enforcement to go after primary motivating factors for the business of trafficking. It allows us to go after the profits. There needs to be more focus on the financial investigations aspect of all trafficking investigations. Financial institutions are here to help. First, with the AML regulations, from the Know Your Customer program to CDD to the requirement to monitor for and report suspicious activity, financial institutions have a prime vantage point. However, they're often operating with little actionable information. They can see the data, but they need to know what the data is telling them. If given more context and/or reliable information, financial institutions can integrate trafficking-specific factors or lists into already existing risk assessments and/or screening processes. They can develop specific topology-driven criteria into their transaction monitoring systems and programs. They can provide more targeted information to law enforcement through the reporting of suspicious activity reports, and potentially even restrict or cut off access to the financial services to these trafficking organizations. So how can we get financial institutions more information? Simple: collaboration. There are many proactive efforts underway today. However, these proactive efforts are often met by people where time and resources are limited, often leading to a lot of missed opportunities to explore and analyze how we can build upon all of these collaborations together. It is with all these concepts in mind that STAT, Stand Together Against Trafficking, was created. At the core of this work is a platform that, with trusted partners from law enforcement, nonprofits like Polaris, financial institutions like Truist, Ally, Western Union, and U.S. Bank, we've come together to identify a methodology and a structure to share all of this great knowledge that is available to the industry today. While focusing first on human trafficking, we know that the financial indicators across the networks share the commonalities and therefore can be leveraged across all areas of trafficking. I've also submitted comments along the lines of the 2 bills that were before the subcommittee today, and I urge the subcommittee to consider involving every community that is involved in the anti-trafficking space. I also urge the committee to consider the framework around Presidential Decision Directive 63, later updated by Homeland Security under Presidential Decision Directive 7, which led to the creation of the Financial Services Information Sharing and Analysis Center, FS-ISAC, to focus on sharing targeted data intelligence to reduce cyber risk in the global systems. I think that this can be leveraged for addressing trafficking today. To disrupt and dismantle a network, we must get ours together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank all of you for your testimony. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes One of the concerns I have that hopefully the panel can help clear up is the issue of whether or not trafficking creates a national security threat. Is it a national security issue? Dr. Casanova.
It is both a national and international security issue, without a doubt, because as you know, in the written statement, I had more time to go into this, but basically we have the commercial market on which we obviously need all these dual-use components and technology and material, and this material is available, and there are export controls systems in place and sanctions regimes, but those who illicitly procure WMD-related items are still, they're able to do it, and so the financial sector is one among the most important actors in terms of trying and limit this access. And if they continue to have access to these components and continue to improve their WMD programs and missile programs, eventually unfortunately, we might have an event that will absolutely show and prove to us that it's a major national and international security threat.
Well, that's not settling. That doesn't make me feel very good. But one of the issues that we discover is that, at least my experience with this committee, is that when there's a crisis, we discover that there's not been much communication. In 2008, we found out that the Fed was not communicating with Treasury and FDIC, and we hopefully have resolved that. So is there the kind of communication and coordination that you think contributes, or the lack thereof, to the growing problem?
I think compared to some other jurisdictions, the U.S. is actually, a little bit, it's above average in terms of interagency communication, but it's still not where it could be or should be. There is definitely space for improvement, and right now, what I see as, externally, I'm not with any government, is that issues are siloed and information and data is siloed, and those, for example, who work on export controls, they see one part of the picture. Financial institutions see another part of the picture. We started having initiatives that are trying to bring these different types of data together, but there is so much more that can be done in terms of just stepping back and looking at all these issues, in a more comprehensive, holistic way. So definitely space for improvement. And it's an easy thing to do. To overcome bureaucracy maybe it's not that easy, but in practical terms, it's something that can be done immediately.
Okay, Mr. Atkins and Ms. Peters, if you were sitting up here with us and you became completely convinced that we needed to do something now, and what would it be? What would you want to do if you were sitting in one of these seats?
Sure. The first thing I would say, Chairman, is to found an initiative that's very similar to what you've done with the bipartisan counter-trafficking initiative. And I think, to speak a little bit to the last question, one of the things that is, I think, misunderstood about many of the transnational and terrorist organizations is the level of connectedness, the level of sophistication, the level of agility, and the level of communications that they have. As Ms. Peters gave a beautiful anecdote about, listening to traffickers' communication, and they're talking about all the different routes that they have. And the fact is that they outstrip us in their ability to connect to one another, to share data and information, to be able to track movements more thoroughly. So in that instance where we fail, they thrive in the gaps of the disconnections and the lack of information that we have. The other thing that I will say, which I think is somewhat shared between the testimony of Ms. Peters and myself, is the idea that we can go after trafficking networks all that we want, but if we do not address and recognize and acknowledge the things that sustain them, the things that give them oxygen, the conditions that give them the space to operate, then we are essentially trying to chuck water out of a boat with a hole in it. And that is these ideas of poverty, instability, official corruption, and conflict, which contribute greatly to the conditions that make people fall victim to trafficking, specifically in persons.
Thank you. Wish we had much more time than we have, but my time is up. I now recognize the gentleman from Arkansas, the ranking member, Mr. Hill.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to thank the panel. Excellent testimony. Thanks for being with us today. I just got back from a trip to the desert in Arizona 2 weeks ago, and that was a keen description, Mr. Atkins, of those gaps even in our own country where human trafficking across the desert is significant. It's primarily a drug and trafficking location across the Sonoran Desert between Nogales and Lukeville, Arizona. And there you have gaps because we're just now putting up the kind of integrated towers that'll give us the both camera and radio transmission technology to back up our border patrol there and other local law enforcement. And they're really at a disadvantage to the cartels who run a much more sophisticated communication operation there on the border. I wanted to start and ask Ms. Peters about this issue of hitting the in between the two martini glasses. There are a lot of people in that mix. Obviously, the cartels, the transnational drug groups, the people who have merged terrorism with traditional smuggling. But the gatekeepers, let's talk a little bit about that. You know, we have SARS in the financial system, and we really monitor the banks. We make the banks our co-partners in this effort. But what are other ways in that gatekeeper arena to interdict some of those trading routes? Lawyers, notaries, accountants, people offer services in those countries. How do we tackle that, Ms. Peters?
I think that we, if I can put it most simply, I think that the strategy should be network focused as opposed to commodity focused. I've seen operation after operation just focus on, say, narcotics, or just focus on wildlife, or just focus on human trafficking, when in part because our agencies, our law enforcement agencies, are restricted by the authorities that they have. And there's been some effort to get around that by grouping agencies together, mainly out at the Special Operations Division of DEA. But even there, I've seen case after case where a lot of data has been left on the table about an organization's criminal activities just because they don't have, the team working it doesn't have the authorities. You never see criminals get wrapped around the axle about what it is that they will traffic in. If they're going to make money off of it, they'll do it. I think Hezbollah, for example, which the U.S. government has repeatedly targeted for drug trafficking, makes more money off of the illegal timber trade, and we don't touch them for that. They make a lot of money off of trading diamonds. That's terrorist financing, and we ought to be going after them for those things. And so I think if we can think about all of the different illicit activities a network is getting up to, and especially to go after the financing of those activities, to be looking for the money, taking the money away from them, those are the ways that I would strengthen some of the operations.
I appreciate that. Well, that's why I emphasize, and we've talked about it for years, about a fusion center operation between our financial sector and our law enforcement sector, reading those financial services people into on a need-to-know basis to look for those patterns of these practices. It's also why I raised the issue of cigarettes, because of trade-based money laundering just passes through our ports of entry all day long, every day, undetected, because it's not an illegal narcotic, and yet the money is using to finance transnational crime. You also raised about the dark web, and of course I want to thank the Trump administration and leadership in Congress both for shutting down Backpage and taking a number of coordinated efforts to stop human trafficking in the worst ways. But Ms. Reliable, could you talk about what else we should do to shut down the internet aspect of illicit trading.
So what we're seeing is that these groups are very innovative, and they're actually much more adaptive than our governments. And what's frightening is that we see also, because of the clientele who tend to be younger and more comfortable in the internet, we're seeing this explosion and transformation and evolution of the drug trade from plant-based, which used to be heroin, marijuana, and cocaine, over to these synthetics, which are much more potent. In your opening statement, you talked about the opioid epidemic. And then what's even more frightening is we're seeing an increase in the US because methamphetamine is being now marketed as the safer alternative to fentanyl. They're combined. And kind of supporting and, more importantly, echoing the other witnesses' testimony about how we should be looking at the gatekeepers are the same. They're out to make money, and it doesn't matter what they're trafficking in. The other thing we see in the case of groups like the Mexican cartels, they're physically controlling the supply chain and the routes, whether it be migrants or actual drugs that are passing through, or avocados to take
Thank you.
advantage of the Super Bowl. I mean, these
Thank
are the
you
types
very
of things
much.
we're seeing.
Thank you.
Thanks. I now recognize the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Perlmutter.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for your testimony today. Some of you have testified here before, and just thank you for your continued vigilance in this area. So I'm going to switch. I want to start kind of in the crypto areas, and with a general question to begin with, and this is to anybody who wants to take it. I mean, cash has long been king for economics generally, but certainly within the trafficking world. And as we move more to cryptocurrencies and the like, have you seen that change? And so, Ms. Peters, let's start with you, and then Dr. Casanova.
Thank you for that important question, and I also wanted to address something that Ranking Member Hill said in his commentary about the dark web. Criminals aren't in the dark. I mean, they are operating in the dark web, but they're using surface web platforms as much as any dark web. That's where the customers are. I don't know how to get on the dark web. I don't know about any of you. If you want to sell drugs to people, or you want to sell sex or ivory, it's on Facebook. It's on Instagram. These platforms provide the same anonymities as the dark web and a far greater reach of customers. With regards to your question about crypto, we haven't seen evidence that major criminal organizations have moved institutionally into blockchain currency. In fact, they seem to be as concerned about the risk and the instability of cryptocurrencies as regular consumers are. That being said, there is an increase, in particular in Europe, it's being tracked, but we do not, what I see looking at money laundering all the time is that criminals still want to get their money into the US dollar or the euro. They want to be in major currencies.
Okay. Dr. Casanova, did you have a comment?
Yes. The cyber domain and crypto domain is what we see as an emerging threat, and a threat that we do not understand fully yet. I'll just give you an example of North Korea. They have been extremely successful with cyber attacks on financial institutions, forced transferring money from banks, for example. They also attack cryptocurrency exchanges. And so on crypto, for example, they not only mine cryptocurrency, they also steal it, both from exchanges but also from other users. And then they engage in those layered multiple online transactions so that the tail of it is completely lost. And it's extremely difficult to track what they use this money for. And then eventually, we know that, for North Korea, their WMD program is one of their most important national projects. So for sure, some of that money is being used for proliferation activity. And just to give you a data point, it is believed that North Korea illegally obtained up to $2 billion through cyber activities.
All right, so let me follow up with that, and again, to the entire panel. North Korea, Iran, Russia maybe, can you all discuss the role on corruption in foreign governments and how it may or may not affect our efforts to stem this international trafficking. And Mr. Adkins, why don't you take a shot at that?
Sure. I think that it is at the heart of this trafficking piece. And so what I've submitted in my written testimony is the notion that trafficking is in fact a symptom and a driver of official corruption. And so one of the things that folks who traffic in persons are doing is, yes, they are criminals, but they are also doing bribes and kickbacks to political officials, to border control and law enforcement agents, and essentially utilizing the networks that are supposed to defend against them as part of their efforts to make the kinds of illicit trade that we do see. And in many governments, of course, there is this idea of actual complicitness from the very senior levels of the government on down in having certain countries be transit points. And I think that's one of the reasons that we see specific countries at the top of the list for efforts like this.
So, sort of in your vernacular up there, these countries would be, in effect, big facilitators.
Absolutely.
Okay. I'd yield back to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman from North Carolina, the ranking member, Mr. McHenry, is now recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. Ms. Peters, I want to start with you. So give me the contours of this. So in terms of trafficking for us as American policymakers, how many people are we talking about that are directly involved, that have the logistical capacity for the larger scale movement of people and products for illicit trade?
Well, I'm not sure I could give you a number globally for that, but it's a much smaller number than, say, the farmers growing drugs or the people selling drugs, say, on the streets. I can give you examples of a number of networks that I've worked on. It's been a handful of people at the top. I'm talking about a dozen or less, including their financial operation. Now, what you'll see is that a trafficking network will often outsource aspects of its work. They might outsource the money laundering to a fixer organization like Mossack Fonseca is a good example that was catering to a lot of illicit organizations. But I've worked on a number of big projects where there was a dozen or less, or just a few dozen people at the top of the bureaucracy. But these are identifiable bureaucracies in every
Okay, so what are
operation.
those vulnerabilities? So you have identifiable bureaucracies. What are some of those key vulnerabilities that I need to understand?
The key vulnerabilities are the brokers that have the capacity to move containers through the transnational systems. There's not a lot of people who have that capacity.
So policing the brokers, okay.
Identifying who are the folks that have the capacity to move illicit containers through transnationally. There's not a lot of networks that have the capacity to do that.
Okay.
And then identifying the financial, the teams within those big networks that are running the financial aspects of it. If you can interdict them, it's often more impactful to the overall operation of the network than simply arresting or killing the kingpin.
Okay, so tell me the most uninteresting product that has been used to illicitly finance terrorism and other activities that you've talked about.
The most uninteresting?
Yes, uninteresting, because you come in, we hear ivory all the time, but when you say timber, I think, well, this is not the normal discussion we have as policymakers. We understand with Ms. Rea-Luyo, your explanation of the illicit drug trade. We hear that a lot. We don't hear timber, though. So why? Why timber?
So what you see is a phenomenon in places when there's been a crackdown, say, on narcotics or ivory, that criminals will diversify into another profit-making sector where they perceive there to be lower risk. Africa has these incredible forests of 1,500-year-old hardwoods that are in high demand in China, where there are timber shortages and a lot of demand for wooden furniture. So the trunks of these trees will sell for $150,000 each. That's a huge amount of money, and nobody's really looking at it. So we've seen a lot of groups move into that.
Okay,
you know.
this is helpful. It's helpful to have this in the conversation. Ms. Ray Aluyo, I mentioned that we hear a lot about the drug trade, but when we hear fentanyl, we commonly think China. So, but we have an issue that you're an expert on in terms of what's happening right now in Mexico. Can you walk us through the contours of that? Because my district, like all of us here, has been severely impacted by the opioid epidemic. We have 5 deaths a day in North Carolina as a result of opioids. So if you could speak to that, it would be quite helpful.
Sure. So China continues to be the source country of not just fentanyl, but also other precursor chemicals that fuel the other types of drugs that are coming to our shores. What we're seeing, though, is as the U.S. Postal Service has really stepped up its detection and monitoring operations, as Gretchen explained, these groups are adjusting. So what's happening is they're diverting into the ports in Mexico, where that's where the clashes among the cartels that are very violent lately are trying to take place. And in Mexico, there has been proof that laboratories there are themselves now manufacturing fentanyl as well as methamphetamine. Why are the Mexican cartels so important is that they're actually now being used as the route, instead of through the Postal Service. Almost every day you hear about news in airports, and more importantly, Postal Service workers being much more aware of what we're doing. So we're seeing it in terms of awareness, detection, but more importantly, the nimbleness of these groups, and more importantly, fentanyl and laced fentanyl products are actually much more lucrative and much easier to make.
So this means we have to have heightened awareness for customs, right?
Yes, correct.
At our borders, to understand that custom agents and their capacity, their technological capacity, is supremely important when it comes to human trafficking and trafficking of all kinds.
That's right, and we're trying to protect both on the U.S. and Mexican side, those who are the first responders and the law enforcement agents, because it's even overwhelming our dogs that are doing detection.
Thank you. Thank you.
The gentleman from California, Mr. Vargas, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for this hearing. And of course, I thank the witnesses. The number of people that are victims of human trafficking really is staggering. The suffering that we see in our own country, and I'm from San Diego, so we certainly have it there in large quantities, unfortunately. And the suffering that happens around the world is, again, something that's monstrous. And I do think it is, as stated earlier, a national, international security issue. Trafficking has the victims that are directly abused, but also the funding for terrorism and other illicit crimes like drugs that was spoken about. And interestingly, Ms. Peters, you brought up the issue of the tech companies, how they're involved in a sense, not actively in that they want their technology to be used in this way, but it is being used in this way. And I'm from California, and I was in the legislature there for some time, and to be truthful, we always protected the tech companies to make sure that this new technology, this creative industry that we had could flourish because it was in its infancy, and we saw the opportunities that it provided. And so we haven't leaned on it very hard. We haven't burdened it very hard as we have the banking systems and other systems because they're more mature. So I do want to dig down a little bit on that because it is intriguing when you say that we need to do more in the sense, and you juxtaposed it to the banking system. Could you go a little deeper in that?
Yes.
In your comments?
When the Communications Decency Act, Section 230, was passed a quarter century ago, there were only about 25 million Americans using the internet, and most of them connected through a telephone dial-up. Social media was not a thing. The iPhone was not a thing. Smartphones were not a thing. And the tech algorithms that connect people did not exist either. So today we live in a world, first of all, where the tech industry is no longer in its infancy. It no longer, I think, warrants the protections that it was
Right.
given.
In fact, the wealthiest companies.
The wealthiest companies in the world. There's also an enormous amount of venture capital in Silicon Valley supporting the emergence of new firms. They don't need the support that they used to get, in my opinion. Second of all, their tech algorithms are connecting buyers and sellers of illicit goods faster than these companies' own beleaguered moderators can remove the material. So I think they'd get a lot better at moderating illicit activity and removing illicit activity if they were facing serious liabilities for hosting it. Our motto at the Alliance to counter crime online is if it's illegal in real life, it should be illegal to host it online. I'm not talking about getting rid of the liability shield for tortious commentary. I still think there should be Yelp reviews and people should be allowed to forward emails without risk of liability to the tech firms. But we need to have carve-outs for serious crime activity. And I'm very pleased to see that Senators Graham and Blumenthal have put forward new legislation about human trafficking. But I want to ask them, why only human trafficking? We've got upwards of 60,000 Americans dying a year from drug overdoses, most of which is being bought and marketed online. Why is that still allowed? Why are terrorist organizations still allowed to have Facebook pages? It's crazy. This should not be happening. I have a fact sheet that I've turned in with my testimony that gives you an overview of the types of crime we're tracking online, and it's breathtaking.
Thank you. You didn't mention so much cryptocurrency, though, you had earlier. I do have a bill that passed out of here last year, the fine bill that asked didn't ask, but directed the Comptroller General to carry out a study to find out how it's being used. Could someone address that? Because I agree with you. I mean, it's hard for us, just to be frank. I mean, we don't like to put regulations, Republicans don't, on industry. The Democrats don't like to do it on new creative industry. And I think that's why we've given tech a pass. And with all the things that are happening now, I don't think we should give them a pass. I think that we should drill down deeper. But could someone, and I only have 30 seconds left, talk about cryptocurrency? Yes, Ms. Riayu, go ahead.
Well, we haven't seen a mass movement from traditional criminals to the crypto space because still cash is king to pay your assassins and your distributors. There is a move afoot among the terrorist groups, particularly returning foreign fighters of ISIS, who've gone underground to use other ways to communicate, but also to try to raise money and support themselves. It's no secret that Hamas actually has advertised that you can donate to their organization using a Bitcoin, and they even give you the instructions on how to do it. What they don't really know is it's not fully anonymous. But we'll keep that amongst ourselves in terms of being able to track.
Let's keep that one among ourselves. My time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Williams, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And it's heartbreaking to hear the horrific stories coming from human trafficking survivors. As a father of 2 daughters and a beautiful granddaughter, I cannot begin to imagine any of them being subjected to this type of abuse. So before I begin with my questions, I want to sincerely thank the chairman for calling this hearing. I want to thank all of you witnesses for being here today to share your expertise with all of us. Monopoly market, Empire market, dark market, White House market are all just a few of the more than 40 online vendors where you can buy thousands of different types of drugs over the internet. These websites are operating in plain sight, as we've said today, and you can find information about each with a simple Google search, as you said, and customers can leave reviews. Vendors say exactly how their drugs will be shipped, how the websites will walk you through the payment process step by step. White House Market publishes that they have over 15,000 listings from 1,300 vendors on their platform alone. So almost 200 Americans die every single day from drug overdoses, yet all these websites are still online as we speak, and we've touched on that. So, Ms. Peters, let me ask you, what can be done to allow our government from being more, from being more aggressive in taking down these illegal online marketplaces that are hubs for trafficking drugs?
We would like to see Congress remove the liability shield that the tech industry currently enjoys for hosting serious organized crime content. I believe that having spoken to them, I believe that the authors of CDA 230 intended that liability shield only to pertain to speech, as opposed to which I agree should be protected, as opposed to illicit activity. So we believe that there should be carve-outs for that issue specified, as was done with FOSTA SESTA when it passed with regards to human trafficking. We believe that tech firms should be legislated to, similar to the financial industry, to hand over data they have about illicit activity on their platforms to law enforcement. And we'd also like to see Congress appropriate more resources to the law enforcement community to deal with what will inevitably be a deluge of data. I'll give you an example. Facebook only began tracking drug sales on its platform last year, which is kind of incredible. And in the first quarter of last year, they removed 4.4 million postings that were selling drugs. To put that in perspective, that's 400 times larger than this notorious dark website, the Silk Road, ever was, 4.4 million postings.
Thank you. Any sustainable long-term solutions to shut down these complicated trafficking networks will require a coalition from countries across the globe, I think, and since some other countries might not have the same resources or capabilities to go after human traffickers. So, Ms. Atkins, what can the United States do to help those nations that will need to bring in as partners to stop this horrible practice?
It's a great question. I think that when we talk about technical support, when we talk about the support that we have over the last decade or so that has been diminishing for democracy and governance, support from the United States to countries that have issues with weak governance, what is our engagement in international conventions and data sharing types of initiatives that can help support those types of countries to improve in those sectors. But I think the real issue is that they are not just falling behind because of lack of capacity, but mostly because of the lack of resources. And this is kind of the main thrust of my appearance today, is that these are generally poor countries, many of whom are mired in unresolved conflict, many of whom cannot even provide the most basic services for their citizens. And so when you get into the higher order level things around border protection, around legislation, and law enforcement, these nations would be weaker in those areas across the board. And so then human trafficking is only a small slice of the deficiencies that they would have in being able to protect their territories and their citizens.
Okay, real quick, Dr. Casanova, can you discuss how North Korea most regularly accesses the global financial system and the role Chinese financial institutions play in their ability to obtain critical WMD technologies?
And I can be politically incorrect. So China is among jurisdictions that actually of great concern to the non-proliferation community. Over the years, we've seen progress both on export controls and their non-proliferation policies and clamping down on this kind of activity, but it's still not enough. So specifically on North Korea, most of North Korea's sanction evasion and illegal access to international markets and financial systems does involve China, and I shouldn't say China, but middlemen, agents, brokers, front companies that are based in China. Okay. But I want to recognize that over the years there have been improvement, but it's not where we want to see the government.
Okay, thank you. I yield my time back.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from Massachusetts, Ms. Presley, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Cleaver, for waving me on, and Ranking Member Hill for holding this hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for sharing your expertise with us today. The deprivation of women's bodily autonomy for political ends is not a phenomenon limited to one time or place. From Boko Haram and al-Shabaab kidnappings to small-scale Boston traffickers, exploiters are making a profit by trading in trauma and condemning families to a lifetime of fear for their children's safety. Mr. Atkins, how is trafficking used to further the goals of these insurgencies? And why is human trafficking, including sexual exploitation specifically, so effective in terrorizing local communities?
Thank you for your question, Representative Presley. The first thing that I would say is that there is a general overarching sense in the world of essentially patriarchy and the diminishment of the value, worth, and protection of women in our society and certainly in many nations abroad. And so that would be kind of the overarching piece of this. The second piece is that even though terrorist organizations don't have very strong links in terms of the actual transport and kind of cross-border movement of trafficked persons, they certainly are consumers of trafficked women and children, as porters, as sex slaves, concubines, as people to be forced into marriage. And so essentially what trafficked people create for many of these terrorist organizations is a base of consumption to feed themselves, to sustain their movements, to keep the morale of their soldiers high, to actually entice young men to join on to terrorist movements with this idea that you would have power at the point of a gun and that you would have access to women all the way up to your liking. The other piece of this is that, again, even though the ties are not strong in terms of linking them directly to doing trafficking, that they actually create the conditions that induce vulnerability for more people.
Okay.
And so because of what Boko Haram has been doing in Nigeria, trafficking writ large in Nigeria has become a more serious problem. And it's a more serious problem for more vulnerable people. And so any type of organizations that create displacement, that create refugee flows, that create internally displaced persons are, by dint of that action, creating more people who will be disconnected from state services and protection, disconnected from their families, and then by dint of that, more vulnerable to being brought into the dark underworld of transnational criminal organizations and terrorist groups.
Thank you. Thank you for that comprehensive response, Mr. Atkins. Just in the interest of time, I'll try to conflate my two final questions and hear from whoever would like to contribute. I want to bring a survivor into to the discussion. I represent the Massachusetts 7th, work closely with a survivor-led organization called My Life, My Choice, and the Ava Center as well, who work with survivors of trafficking to rebuild and recover. Now, survivors face obstacles in reclaiming their financial agency. This is something we don't often talk about. My Life, My Choice shared the story of one such survivor, Kendra. She grew up in state care due to parental substance use and sexual abuse in the home. By age 13, had met her first exploiter. Kendra continued to face sexual exploitation through her teens and her early 20s. By the time she escaped for good, her Social Security had been stolen by her exploiters, and credit cards and an auto loan fraudulently taken out in her name. Although case managers were able to help Kendra appeal this credit fraud in court, many survivors lack access to this support. So I just want to make sure that we're thinking both about prevention and recovery. So Ms. Nugent-Swift, how can banks better help survivors appeal and correct fraud and reclaim ownership of their finances?
Thank you. An extremely important issue. I think there are two connected items here that you've hit. One is how do we restore credit for the survivors? And then two, how do we get them access once they've extracted themselves from their lived experience? There's a lot of efforts that are being done today with banks through the Liechtenstein Initiative, who are trying to create internal policies and procedures in order to evaluate with social work organizations new accounts that are being created for survivors so that they can get their foot in the door. Once they get their foot in the door, then their accounts and can go through the normal system, and then they can build their credit that way. But I think the root cause really is how do we restore credit for the survivors, because if we are able to help them restore their credit and we're able to help that conversation start, then they can apply for any type of financial services. So I think we need to bring those agencies who are responsible for evaluating credit to the table to have that conversation to identify solutions. So credit bureaus and agencies and things like that. Banks, unfortunately, cannot because once bad activities happen, then...
Gentlelady's time has expired. Thank you.
Thank you.
Gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Gonzalez, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you to our witnesses for being here, Chairman Cleaver, Ranking Member Hill for holding this hearing on such an important topic. I'm thrilled to know that this is the first in a series of hearings. It's good to know that we're going to beef up our understanding of what is a critical issue in Ohio, where I'm from, but also across the country. We've been in many respects ground zero for the opioid crisis, fentanyl trafficking, but also human trafficking, which is something that our office has been working on for the past year or so. Ms. Peters, I want to start with you because I think this is a really interesting point that you touched on with respect to Section 230. I have an open question, which I'm just curious for your thoughts on. So I think there's kind of two minds that I could take with that. One would be liability moves to the platforms themselves, like a Facebook, YouTube, et cetera. The other could be maybe liability in some respects, at least for these dark websites, could move to the hosting services, right? Do you have a sense of, I guess, why would you go in the direction you've gone as opposed to the hosting services? And I'm curious, generally curious, because I think this is a tough topic.
We believe that the platforms hosting the data as opposed to the website host should hold the liability because they're mainly talking about platforms that are free to use. So these platforms make money by harvesting the data of their users. The notion that they don't know what is going on is absurd to me.
Yeah, I agree with you.
And so I think that in particular those platforms should have a lower liability shield. I would feel, to me, putting that liability on the web hosting devices it would be kind of akin to putting liability onto a telephone service that's just carrying messages. However, if you have a illicit organization like, say, the Sinaloa cartel or Hezbollah that actually has a website, they shouldn't. I don't think they should be allowed to.
Yeah, and there are certain hosting services that specifically focus on the Sinaloas of the world, right?
And they should be targeted for that. I agree, but but ordinarily, I would say if a web hosting service is hosting a platform and that platform is hosting illicit activity, to me, the platform is at fault.
Yeah, I think I generally agree. I'm still thinking through it because I think there's
also a very interesting debate about the question of strict liability regimes or duty of care, which I'd be happy to discuss at nauseam, but it's a very important issue to discuss.
Okay. And then, Ms. Realuyo, with extremism, a lot of times we see the conversation starts on a Facebook, a YouTube, sort of a traditional platform, and then at a certain point it bumps off and goes into the fringe platform world. Is your sense that that's what's happening in the trafficking world as well, where it's starting on a Facebook and then it's moving to a dark website, or is it actually transacting on Facebook directly?
When we take a look at all these groups, whether they be terrorists or criminal in nature, you still have to have a human interface. So we're now studying a lot of the ISIS foreign fighters that have come back, and more importantly, with partnership with several of our international counterparts, trying to better understand, like, why did that Tunisian young man, how did he get involved? And then more importantly, more interestingly, in Western countries like Europe and the United States, they get drawn in because of the accessibility of that propaganda online. But then more importantly, there usually is a physical facilitator who helps them to make that voyage to the Islamic State, and now we're much more concerned with the ones that are coming back. What we're seeing too in terms of trafficking, in terms of whether it's drugs or people, there's still a physical, because you have to actually, there's some goods that have to be transferred.
Right.
And we need to equally watch, monitor, understand, but more importantly, go after both that push online, but more importantly, those who are actually physically engaged in the trafficking.
And then if you can do this in 30 seconds, you highlighted how coordination is essential. I completely agree. I think most people said that on the panel. Legislatively, what is one thing we can do to make sure the coordination does happen more frequently than it currently does?
Having been in and out of government the last 20 years, once you all require a congressional report, it actually focuses the different agencies to have a sense of concentrated mission. And what we're seeing now, particularly in the military, is we look at threat finance across all the different regions, and then more importantly, across all what we call the modalities, whether it's weapons of mass destruction, human trafficking, gold. We didn't really talk about Venezuela, which is the true trafficker of gold, oil, and drugs in terms of facilitation. But we're getting better at it.
Thank you. My time is up. I'll follow up. I yield back. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Utah, Mr. McAdams, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here today to share your expertise on this very important topic, and one that I think we've got to do a better job about combating. Trafficking takes shape in many forms and has many victims, whether it's the over 20 million people trafficked into forced labor or sexual exploitation, or the drugs that are trafficked into our country that devastates families and communities. And while they have differences for sure in what is trafficked, we know that they also share commonalities. So I'm glad that this hearing is exploring the topic in more depth and hopefully will provide lawmakers some direction on how to better counter these various forms of illicit activity. So my first question, Ms. Nguyen Swift, you noted that financial institutions are well situated to assist law enforcement in identifying strong investigative leads, given that different trafficking networks are often exhibit overlapping financial indicators. Can you elaborate on how some of these networks operate similarly from a financial perspective, and what type of indicators can we see?
Sure. Often, at the end of the day, all types of trafficking is a business, and financial services companies provide a limited amount of products. And so checking accounts, business accounts, credit cards, prepaid cards, cryptocurrency has been echoed multiple times today. There are only certain ways that you can actually get money into that system and out of that system. And so if you're looking at criminal business enterprises, right, they have to rely on those various products. Some of the topologies that we've seen across multiple levels of trafficking are business accounts that are being opened under multiple shell company names. However, they share similar account managers, they share similar owners, and they share certainly similar patterns of activity in dealing with the same third parties. So if we're able to understand more context around what those relationships look like, and that comes from intelligence, then we're able to pinpoint and understand more what networks they are part of.
And maybe a related question, do we have a good understanding about how some of those networks may operate differently as they flow through the regulated financial system, different forms of trafficking? That is, do we understand how human trafficking network would appear as it proceeds through the financial system compared to how a drug trafficking network would appear?
There are some indicators that you can kind of tell the difference with. So for example, with credit cards, the types of purchases you might see are going to differ. In a human trafficking brothel situation, you're going to see a lot of feminine products being purchased. In a drug trafficking, probably not, unless there is a home that is also being leveraged where a lot of women are working. So from a financial institution perspective, it is hard to tell some of those nuances. The only way to do that is with getting contextual information from experts in the industries that are working in those specific areas. So there are some telltale signs, but we need to know what they are.
Thank you. In the written testimony, several of you talked about both potential advantages and disadvantages to technology in the trafficking of goods. Professor Realuyo, you noted that opioid buyers can visit dark websites anonymously using special browsers and make purchases with virtual currencies like Bitcoin, making transactions difficult to trace. And Dr. Casanova, you testified that adopting technical solutions to monitoring trade finance transactions, including by adopting blockchain-based trade finance platforms, can play a role in uncovering suspicious transactions. How should we as policymakers be thinking about the role that emerging technologies can play in trafficking and illicit financing, whether that be AI or digital currencies, et cetera? And are there ways that we can harness these technologies to fight trafficking?
Great to see you again.
You too.
So I really see, more importantly, because I kind of traverse the private and then the public sector, what we really need is just greater research, and then more importantly, on the government side, we need much more investment in law enforcement and intelligence training to understand what these technologies present as an upside, but more importantly, the dark side and what that back door is. Because as they modify and more importantly, adapt, incorporating this new technology to improve the efficiency of their businesses, they understand what our countermeasures are, and we need to step up the pace of what our measures are in order to detect particularly, but more importantly, try to figure out how to better work also with the private sector, that they become the eyes and ears of what's happening in their sector.
Thank you. Dr. Casanova.
Thank you for this chance to kind of give a bit of a positive side of new technology. So for proliferation financing, when I talk to the representatives of the financial institutions, they feel a little bit overwhelmed that, you know, if we start checking everybody so deeply, then it will slow down our transactions. And so for them, the main challenge is how to operationalize the risk and automate it. And this is where technology can come in very handy. And just to give Two specific examples. It's the pilot blockchain-based trade finance platform, Voltron, that I was referring to. And the people behind it, they're more interested in efficiency. But because it provides better transparency, you can have a collateral positive effect in finding out some suspicious actors. Artificial intelligence, for example, there are startups that are working on that, and this is the untapped potential of technology, and I think, from where we sit, there are definitely...
I'm going to have to cut you off.
Yeah,
The gentleman's
definitely
time,
ways to use it for
gentleman's
positive.
time has expired. He can submit more questions to you in writing, and you can finish that. Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Taylor, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate this hearing. I think it's, first, I appreciate the bipartisan nature of it. I appreciate the lack of theatrics in this particular hearing. I'm the newest member of the committee, so this is a first for me. And also, I think the scale of what we're talking about is really incredible. If you think MasterCard processes $1.7 billion, or $1.7 trillion of transactions annually, and that's about what we're talking about here. So just to kind of give us a scale, I think this is very impressive. I just want to understand, and actually, Ms. Peters, I've been hearing about your exploits for years from my wife, Ann, who was your roommate at college. And so I just wanted to ask, crypto versus cash wires versus hard cash. So kind of thinking about those three, electronic transactions versus cryptocurrency versus hard cash. What are you seeing kind of as the makeup in illicit trade broadly in your experience?
So, well, before I answer that, I just wanted to very quickly make the comment that I don't think blockchain is necessarily something we should fear. Blockchain technology holds the promise of actually tracking financial assets better. I think the risk is that non-governmental actors, from Facebook to the founders of various cryptocurrencies, are trying to get involved in managing world currencies. This should be the role of governments, not companies, and certainly not illicit actors. So I think there's a need for the US government to look into perhaps releasing its own blockchain currency or something like that, but it should not, we don't necessarily need to think of it as a blockchain as a bad thing. I also want to make the point that we used to talk about, those of us who are interested in the financing of crime, our battle cry to our teams used to be to follow the money. It always takes you to the leaders. These days, when I work with a team of investigators, I instruct them to follow the value. We often see criminals moving illicit value through commodity trades, whether it's a group like Hezbollah or the Taliban, who got very deeply involved in the used car trade. You buy a used car, how much is a used car worth? It's like asking how long is a piece of string. You can put any value on it you want, and you move that value through the system. We've seen this, I've seen this across the world in multiple sectors. I even worked on an investigation once in South
I'm sorry
Africa.
to just try to refocus you back on my original
sorry,
question,
sorry.
which was, what are you seeing in terms of illicit transactions? And so the 1.7 trillion transactions we're talking about today, in hard cash, right, like physical dollars,
Right.
versus electronic transactions versus crypto? Like, what is that mix? Is that an 80,
What I'm actually
20?
saying, I don't think there's a huge amount of crypto. It is growing, but I think that the bulk of criminal transactions that we see are put into trade. Criminal networks that I have studied across the world and across various sectors of crime will buy commodities. The first.
So you're saying it's a barter, you're saying the transfer
Literal barter of
barter
goods.
across, but it's obviously there's cash at the consumer
And the cash
side.
will move through banks, but it will be hidden as a trade-based money laundering operation.
Okay, so it's electronic transactions that
Yes,
are,
and there's a significant amount of cash-based smuggling, particularly in certain sectors. But I certainly have worked on cases where we've seen literally plane loads of cash being moved from one country to
so
another.
hard cash is
Hard cash.
big, and electronic,
Bulk cash smuggling certainly takes place, but cash is heavy. It's hard to place back into, physically heavy, and it's hard to place back into the financial system, so it becomes a burden. What I see as the far biggest phenomenon of how illicit money moves around the world is in trade-based money laundering transactions.
but it's electronic transactions masked as trade.
Ultimately, yes, it moves through the SWIFT system.
Okay, and then the other, we've got about a minute here. So the other question I had for you was the dark web versus legitimate websites. right? So Silk Road, and there was a pretty good Wired magazine article a couple years back talking about the giving taxonomy of Silk Road. They were estimating that it was about $50 million of transactions per month that were taking place on Silk Road. What's incredible is the amount of resources that went into that, and literally it led to the sentencing of just one person, right? So, I mean, you're moving 50 million of drugs a month, tremendous amount of law enforcement by the United States, and like only one person went to jail on that particular website. What are you seeing dark web transactions versus legitimate website transactions? In other words, if we pursued your 230 liability idea just for legitimate websites, Facebook, what is that going to do versus?
So my organization focuses exclusively on illicit activity that's happening on surface web platforms, simply because we don't have the capacity to also look at the dark web. There's so much of it happening on ordinary platforms that are on all of our phones: Google, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, WeChat. There is certainly illicit activity taking place in the dark web, but most people don't know how to get onto the dark web.
All right,
And
thank
so-
you. I apologize, I'm out of time. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. I should say Mr. Hill and Mr. Foster of Illinois are working on digital currency issues that you just brought up as to whether or not there should be a federal digital currency or not. But I want to turn to another gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Garcia, and he is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Hill, for this hearing, and thanks to all of the outstanding witnesses who have joined us today. Your testimony shows how critical financial services and the global financial system are to illegal trafficking networks, and how connected those networks are to the wide range of policies we consider at the federal level, from drug policy to international relations. On cartels and U.S.-Mexico policy, Professor Realuyo, you shared a lot of information with us about the cartels in Mexico. Drugs are flooding north into the U.S., guns are heading south into Mexico, and each side seems to blame the other. In your written testimony, you note that 80% of weapons used by criminals in Mexico come from the U.S. President Trump and Mexican President López Obrador have pledged to work together to curb arms trafficking, but this has been a contentious issue for years. Professor Realuyo, have there been any substantive changes recently in how both countries deal with the smuggling of weapons?
So sadly, because of what happened to the LeBaron family in November, we have always had these bilateral security cooperation meetings, but this time both sides have actually dedicated much more visibility and time to looking at the firearms trading. So when I spend lots of time on the border, and when you cross the border, very rarely does the U.S. actually check outbound, and even more rarely do the Mexicans check what's coming inbound. So we went to Nogales, crossed 4 times just as a test with an unmarked, not a government vehicle, just to take a look. And unfortunately, they didn't check for cash or guns. What we're trying to do, too, is try to raise awareness. And what's also quite interesting is once they did the study, there's a lot of diversion because of the corruption of the security forces in Mexico of guns that are also being used by the cartels of diversion. So at least it's an agenda item that's been raised to the higher in terms of every meeting that's had now with Ambassador Landau there. They're actually focusing a lot more because of the violence rate that was record last year in Mexico.
And as a follow-up, what policy changes could we make here in Congress to help curb the flood of guns to Mexico? And a brief one, please.
Yes, well, obviously each state, as we know, in our federal system, has its own recognition of how they control the sale of guns. But more importantly, I think raising awareness of the average American of that the violence that could come to our borders is actually caused by the firearms that are coming from the United States. It's nothing new, but sadly it takes these breaking news events on CNN and Fox News to actually get the average American to realize this. And sadly, no congressional district is immune to the opioid epidemic, as you know from your state.
Thank you so much. Dr. Casanova, on the topic of transparency and corporate ownership, you write that the U.S. lags behind many countries in requirements for transparency about who owns companies and trusts. This is a problem for the proliferation of weapons, but it has effects throughout our economy. Dr. Casanova, how would bringing U.S. Transparency standards for corporate ownership in line with EU standards make it easier for law enforcement and regulators to catch bad actors?
So I think it will help on two levels. It will help domestically because then we'll know, in terms of in the U.S. context, who is actually controlling the companies, standing behind the companies, because we know there is so much deceit that is happening behind the non-transparent corporate structures. But there is also another level which is connected to the international context and the norm-making. The more countries you have who require that transparency, the more you reduce the space in which these malicious actors can operate.
Okay, thank you. And at the 56-second mark, Ms. Swift, how can industry and regulators work together to make sure that we have the best information possible for investigating and stopping financial crimes?
Thank you. I think that the industry needs to learn more from investigators. I think government is in a very special place to be able to make that happen. Right now, there are a lot of disparate opportunities that are happening, conversations that are happening, intelligence gathering that's happening. However, there's not one coordinated effort in order to bring all of this knowledge and data together so that we can learn from it collectively. So I think government is in a place where they can pull together reports, pull together studies and committees with the appropriate actors and appropriate stakeholders in order to move that ball forward.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Mr. Timmons from South Carolina is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Professor Realuyo, I went to McAllen, Texas with a number of my colleagues a year ago in March, and it was what I would consider maybe the height of the challenges we were facing at the southern border. It was really eye-opening and shocking, the stories we heard from the Customs and Border Patrol and the ICE agents. Is it your understanding that things have improved in the last 12 months? Could you speak to that?
Sure, just from the official data, when we take a look at, so we usually look at the border crisis in terms of the movement of migrants and then more people and then the movement of drugs. And there had been some hypotheses that this huge onslaught of taking care of people first before drugs actually allowed the drug traffickers to take advantage of this idea of the bubble, right, in terms of the balloon that you squeeze. The numbers are quite promising in terms of the lower number of interdictions, and more importantly, what we're seeing in terms of people moving. And that's actually attributed to a lot of the cooperation with Mexico. Earlier in the hearing, we talked about what do we need to do with our international partners to address these very challenging issues of trafficking. Once in Mexico, they realized that the problem of migrants not crossing the border was becoming their own problem in terms of social services, health, insecurity. They got wised up, and more importantly, they secured their southern border. This is what you saw last year with the deployment of their newly minted National Guard, which has worked hand in hand with the U.S. in terms of enforcing border security on the southern border with Guatemala with technology, but more importantly on Mexico's northern border, which is our southern border.
So there's been increased manpower on the Mexico side of the border that has helped address this issue.
And technology and skill set. The use of drones now to monitor, and then more importantly, this way of actually doing much more interagency collaboration to figure out where the movement of people and possible shipments of drugs was actually being relocated.
In your testimony, you state that 90% of heroin in the U.S. originates from Mexico. Do you have any statistics on how much fentanyl originates from Mexico?
So that's actually much more difficult because of the amount that's coming through the mail service first. But what is disturbing is that we're seeing more activity and more interest of the Mexican cartels to dominate the synthetic, which is not just fentanyl, but methamphetamine, where we've seen last year an increase of use. So while methamphetamine is not as lethal as fentanyl, many of you know in your districts, it actually manifests in a much more violent and a much more addictive fashion, which then has other consequences in terms of violent crimes and acts that are committed by meth addicts.
I was a state prosecutor for 4 years, and we had issues with fentanyl, but that was just, they were tragedies. They weren't violent crimes, and meth really was a major problem, still is a major problem in my district. Ms. Peters, I hate to say that I've never heard the term timber trafficking before today. Could you talk about how does that work? Just give me a better understanding.
Well, timber trafficking takes place around the globe. I'm not sure if it's on the list of, but it's a very large global.
Are they timbering forests and then saying they got the product from other places,
So
or?
there's a range of things happening. One is illegal deforestation of a range of woods. In some cases, it's endangered wood species or timber species that are protected internationally, like certain rosewood and hardwood species that are then mislabeled and trafficked into, and then smuggled into a end consumer state.
So they're processed and then shipped, and they're mislabeled, and so
Sometimes it's processed. Sometimes it's processed in the place that it's smuggled out of. There will be lumber factories that will cut it down into planks or whatever, or make it into furniture. In other cases, I've seen rough logs exported in containers.
And is the end user generally the United States, Western Europe, or is it all over the world?
It can be the United States. I'm familiar with at least one case that involved lumber liquidators who were busted for, perhaps not knowingly, but importing wood that had been illegally exported from, I believe it was Brazil. But there's a tremendous amount of this timber trafficking going on both in Latin America and in Africa, with a lot of the wood going to China these days, and some of it coming into the United States, certainly.
Would you say oftentimes the end user is not aware that the timber is illegal?
I think yes. Most of the time, the end user is not aware that it's illegal. In terms of the end consumer, I think that's often the case. I'm not sure about the companies that are purchasing the timber in the middle part of the supply chain.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. You're back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Gottheimer, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the ranking member for calling together this hearing, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. I'm very grateful. I recently met with brave law enforcement officers from the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey's police department. As the United States' largest transportation police force, the PAPD has unique experience and a very strong record of combating human trafficking at ports of entry in my region. Since it was founded in the 1970s, the PAPD's renowned Youth Services Unit, located at the Port Authority's Midtown bus terminal, the busiest terminal in the world, has intervened in thousands of human and sexual trafficking cases, saving countless youth from victimization by predators. Ms. Peters, if I can ask you a question, please. Based on your experience regarding trafficking methods here in the United States, should we deploy more frontline officers trained in detecting victims at transportation hubs like airports, trained terminals, bridges, and tunnels, and other facilities?
I believe there are important ways that yes, frontline law enforcement and security forces in places like bus terminals and airports can be better trained to identify and potentially disrupt trafficking events. There have also been some initiatives by different industries, both the trucking industry and members of the transport industry, including firms like UPS and some airlines, to train their drivers to look for what looks like what appears to be trafficking and to report it. So I think those are important initiatives that should be incentivized.
Thank you. Just following up on that, would you support the establishment of a regional center of excellence for human trafficking training for transportation and other specialized police to share techniques and expertise and undergo rigorous training and learn to deal with vulnerable youth and predatory traffickers?
Yes, I think that would be a great idea, in particular in some of, if it were placed in some of the hot spots in this country where there's a large amount of trafficking going on.
And we know, and of course in New Jersey, New York, and that area, in the regional area, there's a significant number. That's correct, right?
New Jersey, I believe, as well as Georgia has a big problem. Texas has a big problem. California. Honestly, it's a nationwide issue, but certain states that are on big trucking routes really are hit hard.
Thank you. That's why I believe this center is so important. Ms. Nguyen-Swift, if I can ask you a question, please. Given your experience as an attorney with the New York County District Attorney's Office and your time in the private sector, can you speak to the importance of financial information sharing and the ability to collect data to analyze, share, and mine to identify patterns and enable criminal investigations?
I think that's the only way we do it. The only way we can successfully prosecute cases is to tell the story through financial evidence which support and corroborate victim and eyewitness testimony. As a prosecutor, we know how difficult it is to bring a case and to be able to rise up to the evidentiary standards that we must prove in terms of the elements of the crime. So the only way that we can absolutely succeed in this is to bring together, again, the data from all aspects and perspectives, and then we learn from that, right? So as we continue to look at these cases, be able to successfully prosecute and understand what data is important, we'll be able to continue to learn and then give back to the financial community, and the cycle goes on.
Thank you. Do you believe the current financial intelligence system we have in place is effective in providing the proper data to law enforcement to combat trafficking?
I think it's getting there, and I think we can do a lot better. I think there are a lot of mechanisms that are currently in place that attempt to get us to that point, but I think it's still very difficult for financial institutions to share information with each other, and not so much with law enforcement, but also the ability for non-financial institutions such as nonprofit organizations, other government agencies to also share back data to financial institutions is extremely important.
Just one more for you. When a transportation police officer makes an arrest of an individual in connection with the trafficking investigation, what information can be used by investigators to track down a wider network?
A wire network?
Wider network.
Anything that person has on them. Identification, any sort of understanding in terms of if there are funds that are on them, phones, any electronic devices. Everything is being done electronically these days, so identification for the machine ID, user IDs, any of those things can be traced to financial records and then ultimately financial transactions that are contained in the wire.
Thanks. I'll just let you know that I've proposed, and shifting a little bit, I've proposed bipartisan legislation called the FASTER Act to help law enforcement freeze the assets of terrorists or other extremists, to prevent these funds from being used, hidden in the system, and used to carry out another attack by friends or family or unknown accomplices. It also calls for a national homegrown terrorism incident clearinghouse for law enforcement to collect and share information on incidents to help investigate and thwart future attacks. I believe this data sharing and other data sharing is essential, and anything we can do in Congress to facilitate information sharing that you were talking about, I think will help, especially in this effort.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for your time today, everyone. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman from New Jersey yields back. Gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Riggleman, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you all for being here. I'm sorry if I'm a little bit excited. The day before I was actually elected, I was a senior consultant at the Pentagon, actually dealing with and hearing attack modalities, title authorities, application of machine learning, and then talking about selectors. I got pretty excited, so we should have some fun today. All the things that I've done for the last 26 years, and this is pretty timely for me. I have a huge district, 10,000 square miles. Axton, Virginia, we just had 4 members of the Jalisco cartel caught, and they're actually in court now just last week. So, and when we talk about methamphetamines, and I appreciate that, that seems to be the drug of choice right now. We have opioids, obviously, activity, heroin, K2, synthetic marijuana, but we also have a massive methamphetamine problem. So I thank you guys for being here today. And I'm going to start with you, ma'am, Ms. Raeliu. Here's what you said, modalities, so I got really excited about that. So we're talking about attack modalities and technologies that we see at the border right now. What do you think the most challenging segment or attribute portions of those modalities are when you're trying to figure out the technology issues that you have? For example, when you're looking at an attack modality, is it knowing our own environment? Is it information sharing? Is it technology within the network? Where do you see those gaps specifically on those modalities when we're talking about on the border and those specific technologies?
So I teach cybersecurity as well, but we're never going to get to the point that technology will replace an actual human being. When you work with a lot of military and law enforcement, we always talk about that sixth sense of that something's not right or a red flag. What we're trying to do is better incorporate the use, whether it's unmanned drones or detection devices, to figure out what is in a container. You still have to have a trained human being and an analyst and law enforcement agent who can actually understand what they're seeing. I had the privilege a couple weeks ago to go to Santo Domingo, which is a huge container port, which is the transit point for a lot of Colombian cocaine going through Dominican Republic, coming to the United States, but even more so going towards Europe. And those X-ray machines are fantastic, but unless we're able to train our counterparts, who are the eyes and ears pushing that border out, it's all for naught, because the technology will never actually replace. And what I fear is that the technology, and more importantly, the illicit networks, are gaining so much ground because they're so much nimble and have tremendous resources to have the better equipment of night vision goggles than our own soldiers do. We need to get much more nimble and also hire a different profile in terms of cyber analysts who can actually help to understand how cyber is the new domain, and then more importantly, what are the cyber instruments that we can use to complement our military intelligence and financial instruments of national power.
Well, and that's amazing you said that, because we were actually trying to template human behavior but with machine learning rules and finding out that we were missing some key segments. Even when we thought we had it right, we just couldn't get it down. And Ms. Peters, when you talk about transnational networks analysis and you talked about information sharing, again, I got pretty excited. I don't hear much when people are talking about title authorities, which is one of the biggest problems that we had in DOD and also in NSA, was actually the information sharing component. And right now, do you see that the biggest issue, is it technology, is it funding, or do you actually think it's the policies that are in place for information sharing that are preventing us from doing a little bit more as far as doing analysis or aggregation of data?
That's a very good question. I would actually probably say all three of those issues to some extent are combined to create the challenges we have. Information sharing, having been on the operational side of some of these investigations, is a really challenging aspect, particularly if you're operating in a multinational environment and you don't quite trust the folks that you're working with. But even within the U.S. interagency, I've seen one group of law enforcement or intelligence operatives try to get credit for something another group does. There are incentives for people not to share data.
That's
correct. And we have to accept that those incentives exist, and that there's also a constant challenge between information sharing and operational security. The more information gets passed around, the less secure it is. I guess I've seen some operations that have worked really well, but it's very much personality driven between the different agents from different agencies, that if they can get along, they can work together great. But I think programs to help those interagency groups particularly in a particular region or on a particular supply chain get to know each other, hang out together, drink some beers together. Those are the kind of things that might sound silly, but they actually
No, they work. I own a
Yes,
distillery.
they really
It works, trust me. It does work. And I think it's really about kicking over rice bowls, isn't it? You know,
I
and
mean, I'm the author of the Martini Glass.
so we could get along very well. And I wish I had more than 10 seconds, because I was going to go to Ms. Nguyen Swift and talk about AI, ML, and actually some of the issues that you have. But I got 5 seconds. I want to yield my time back, and thank you all very much for being here today.
Gentleman from Virginia yields his time back. If he has other questions, he can submit them in writing to the panel. Gentleman from California, Mr. Sherman, who is also the chair of our subcommittee on investor protection, entrepreneurship, and capital markets, is recognized for 5 minutes.
I know it'll come as a shock to my colleagues, but I want to talk a little bit about cryptocurrency. Right now, the biggest currency is Bitcoin. The disadvantage of Bitcoin is you can't really go buy a turkey sandwich with a Bitcoin anywhere around here. There are on-ramps and off-ramps, and eventually you need to convert. We had, sitting where you are now, Dr. Casanova, I'm trying to read that far, our friend Mr. Zuckerberg, who is putting forward the Libra, the Zuckbuck, which, if he's successful, will be the Bitcoin on steroids, and he is envisioned to be a way where you wouldn't need an on-ramp and an off-ramp because you could actually spend Libra. There are two organizations that are allies, Hezbollah and Hamas. And if you're engaged in a criminal enterprise, it helps to have the ideological cohesion of some political cause. Hezbollah has used that very successfully to be an effective drug dealer. Behind you is a screenshot from a video from the Qassam Brigade of Hamas, and it's nice enough that this video has it in both Arabic and English, and we've translated the Arabic. We find out that Hamas does a good job of translating into English. They've got it right there on the screen. Bitcoin is a cryptocurrency that cannot be traced. Ms. Riolo, the video that I've referred to provides Hamas supporters with detailed instructions on how to donate to the terrorist group without tipping off law enforcement. According to the New York Times, the most recent version of the Hamas website, every visitor is given a unique Bitcoin address where he or she can send digital currency, a method that makes donations nearly impossible to track. A recent report by the think tank, the IDC, International Institute for Counterterrorism, indicates that one Hamas-controlled Bitcoin wallet traded 3,370 Bitcoins, or over $29 million, in just one day. How can criminals, terrorists, sanctions evaders use cryptocurrency to evade our efforts? And then I'll ask if anyone else on the panel has a comment on this.
Sure. As we've seen over the past 20 years since the tragic attacks of 9/11, we have been focusing on following the money, but more importantly, our counterparts and our adversaries have been evolving in the way that they're trying to finance themselves and then physically move money. I have seen, and more importantly, have been following this issue of Hamas, and it's very innovative. You've got to give them credit, fundraising schemes. But as we also know, Bitcoin tracing is actually not totally anonymous. What we are worried about is the evolution of thousands of other cryptocurrencies that are much more difficult to trace, that are becoming anonymizers. We've also seen that other groups closer to home, in Venezuela, as many of you know, they're actually using cryptocurrencies to engage not just in criminal activities, but actually how to send remittances. So we have to take a look at how those types of criminal activities in the cyberspace are being co-opted by criminal insurgencies and groups, not just what we would see as the traditional Islamist terrorist groups. We have to be better about monitoring and understanding how they're doing it, but I'm more fascinated by who's actually going on there and then more importantly giving the money, because that's the next generation of fighters that we're going to be.
Hamas and Hezbollah have ideological appeal. ISIS has been destroyed territorially, but not ideologically or theologically. The more capable, the more used these cryptocurrencies are, the more powerful tool they'll be for those trying to escape international, especially U.S. law enforcement. Does anyone else have a, yes, Dr. Casanova?
In the 9 seconds that I have, I'll just give you another example with North Korea, for example, when they do cyber attacks and then do ransomware, they force their victims to pay in cryptocurrency, and then they recycle through several stages. They don't cash out immediately, but they cash out eventually.
Thank you, Mr. Zuckerberg. I yield back.
Gentleman from California yields back. I'd like to thank our witnesses for their testimony today. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to you all for their response, for your response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able. My guess is you will get some additional questions. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. And with that, we are adjourned.